Yeah, I thought your article was super interesting yesterday.
Yeah. Thanks for thanks for finding it interesting and wanting to talk about it.
Yeah, it's kind of my thoughts like going into it. I took one environmental philosophy class at Cal Poly, and it almost kind of reminded me of that. So just kind of upfront in this conversation, I think this is an area I know very little about, but it was interesting hearing your perspective because I think it actually is slightly different from the one that I had before reading the article. So I wanted to see how you'd explain it and then to maybe correct where I might have been wrong in the past a little bit because I definitely like some of the points you're making, but you think you could just kind of like describe kind of the different parts of the article and what you kind of the main point you're putting forward?
Yeah, sure. So last time I talked to you, I was talking about the economic burden from wildfires and the cost effectiveness of doing large scale fuel reduction on the landscape in California. And so one of the big, takeaways from our last conversation is just how detrimental wildfires are to people, measured in economic impact. So it's, the estimates are somewhere around $100 billion a year or a couple percentage points of GDP. So it's a huge, huge impact that wildfires have on people. And I've just, noticed that scaling up this hazardous fuel reduction treatments to the state's articulated goal of a million acres per year can be politically controversial. And I've noticed that the cases both for and against doing that often rely on appeals to nature, or sometimes called the naturalistic fallacy, where basically you are arguing that like the more natural something is, the better it is. And so the case for doing fuel reduction uh, that's based on this naturalistic fallacy would be to say that we screwed things up by excluding fires, that there's kind of a natural fire regime, where there's a lot more frequent fires in the landscape, but we screwed up by excluding fires. And so now there's been way too much vegetation buildup, and we have to go back to the more natural way. So we have to do that actively, basically, like undo what we did wrong so that it can be more natural. So that's the argument kind of for fuel reduction on grounds of being natural. And then the argument against doing it is just kind of the more traditional argument that like anything going, people going into the wilderness or to the land and doing anything is kind of inherently bad, because it's unnatural, because people are unnatural. We shouldn't be messing with nature. Nature has it figured out. Um, we shouldn't. I mean, the kind of the more extreme environmental groups argue that we shouldn't even be fighting fires at all. Just let them burn. Like we can kind of protect communities right at the level of community, but don't fight fires at all out in the wilderness. And so I think both of these arguments based on appeals to nature kind of miss the point from my view, where I think the point is really that wildfires are detrimental to people. And it doesn't matter how natural or unnatural it is, we should be trying to reduce wildfire impact on people, on people's, lives, on people's property, burning down their property, on health. So the smoke impacts are huge, and we're always learning more about that. And then, as I mentioned, on the economy overall. And so I talked about just in general why I think appeals to nature don't really hold up. So there's just the first thing is that it's when you kind of interrogate this distinction between humans and nature, it's kind of this odd arbitrary distinction where like why are we defining one species, humans, and their actions as being fundamentally different from every other species, when you think about that we are just, one branch in the tree of life, and we're made out of materials that we gathered from around us, same elements as every other species. We're powered by the sun just like every other species. And we rearrange and recombine elements in our environment for our own interest, just like every other species. So I actually don't think there's, a fundamental difference between a modern skyscraper and a beaver dam or a spider's web or something. It's just like different species rearranging things in their environment for various purposes. So there's that, but then there's the other notion that natural is inherently good. And so I talk about in the article just, my view of nature, which I think is the scientific view of nature, is that nature is not this benevolent thing in perpetual balance that's a caregiver or something like that. It's dynamic, it's chaotic, and it's amoral, not necessarily immoral, but amoral in the sense that it doesn't care. And so you can think about that in terms of, natural disaster type things like earthquakes or tsunamis or wildfires, or asteroids or things like that. That these things are natural, but they undoubtedly cause a lot of suffering for conscious creatures. But even creatures themselves, you have things like a lot of animals are carnivores, and I talk about carnivore, like just the idea of carnivores in general kind of shows you how brutal of a situation that we're in, that animals eat other animals to take their resources because the competition is so fierce for finite resources, on this planet. And the point I'm just trying to make is that this is a dynamic, chaotic, amoral situation, and so like being natural does not necessarily deserve this status of being inherently good. And so then in that context, we can say, okay, how much wildfire do we want on the landscape? And we don't just have some anchor to go to be like, well, whatever is the most natural amount is like the right amount. And I think that really comes into play if you're thinking about the differences in different landscapes in California, where the forested landscapes certainly have less wildfire in the landscape than they did previous to the 20th century. But the chaparral ecosystems probably have much more fire because human ignitions were causing a higher frequency of fire in those locations. But that doesn't mean that that somehow, we have a different situation in both cases in terms of how much fire we want. So like in Southern California, where there's more fire now than there used to be, we still want to prevent fires there because they're detrimental to humans. And same thing in Northern California, where we have a fire deficit. We just want to be careful about how we're kind of unwinding the bomb of having vegetation build up. So the point here is just, this is what you would learn. I have this book sitting right here, An Introduction to Forestry and Natural Resources. And, the whole idea of managing the land or managing forests is that you have desired goals, you have desired outcomes, you have desired objectives, and you're trying to manage the landscape to meet those objectives. And so I think that it's very fair for an objective to be to minimize wildfire intensity and severity, not necessarily, area burned or frequency, but we don't want wildfires, humans don't want wildfires to necessarily come in and kill the forest, even if certain species take advantage of that. So certain species like wood-boring beetles, require dead snags, dead trees, and then woodpeckers that eat the beetles like that. And so then that's good for them. But we don't necessarily want that. And I think that that's fine. It's fine to say, no, we're going to prioritize actually that we want this forest not to be killed, and we don't want the watershed to have ash in it. And we're never going to agree on what the optimal trade-offs are because we have different values as people. And so that's why we have political disagreements and why we'll never agree on everything. And there's, I like the phrase that there's no solutions, just trade-offs. And so we're going to argue about that. But I guess the fundamental point there is just that we are going to argue about that, and that there's not some anchor that we can just go to and use this easy shortcut of, well, whatever is the most natural is the best.
Interesting. So seems like at the beginning you're describing there that two different ways of thinking about it. Some people say the system's like out of whack because of fire suppression. So we should actually actively manage things to get it back to more normal. And you could put normal in quotes there because it's not only you could say like what is normal going back 50 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years. But then there's the other people who say, no, we shouldn't actively manage it all. We should just completely let it be. That one seems a bit more flawed because we're not just going to let wildfires burn through communities. So in order to do that, you would have to do some suppression. And then since you're like putting yourself into the environment in that aspect, then you've already intervened. So it wouldn't make sense then to just say, "Oh, hands off," because the impact's already there, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think they would say just minimize intervention at all costs. And so the very minimum thing you can do is just do home hardening and don't do any active management of the landscape beyond that, and don't do any firefighting beyond that. And the argument for that is that in a natural environment, there was high severity fire, there was stand replacing fire. And so some species do naturally benefit from that. And so my argument against that would be, well, we're not just going to say whatever is the most natural is the best. We're going to say that there's trade-offs in all of this. And as people, we don't want stand replacing fires for the most part. We don't want high severity fires because they produce a lot of smoke, which is very detrimental to us. They harm our economy. They harm timber production. We do, use wood products. They harm watersheds, all these things that we don't want. And so it's not only about protecting homes from wildfires.
Yeah, so I guess the maybe would you say your priority in this situation is kind of you mentioned that we can have different ideas of what is good. Like I'd imagine there's some people who say the environment above all else, like protect the environment, and then there's some people who say human interests. So are you in the camp of saying protect human life, property, air quality, watersheds, and then nature like comes second?
I mean, I'm more sympathetic to the raising of human interests above certain other interests, but it's not a universal thing, right? Like we could say, oh, we are going to prioritize wildfire mitigation over everything else, and so therefore let's pour concrete over the entire state, right?
Mhm.
And like I don't want that. Nobody, like I don't know of anyone that wants that, right? We want forests and we want healthy, quote unquote, healthy forests. But like what, I say quote unquote healthy because it's like healthy for what? Like what species? Like what exactly, do you want things to look like? So these things are complicated questions. And my point is not that there's some clean answer of exactly how things should look. My point is that exactly that you can't just say, well, whatever's the most natural is the cleanest answer.
Gotcha. So in the case of like natural being good, I feel like I understand that natural doesn't necessarily mean good for humans because as you pointed out, like cancer is natural, volcanic eruptions are natural, earthquakes are natural. But could you make the argument that since we've had fire, you mentioned it in the article, for about 400 million years, that's selected certain species that actually take advantage of wildfire? There's a lot of them that require wildfire for like their survival and their reproduction. So in a way, wildfire, could you say that what would be the natural fire regime for those specific environments, wildfire would be good in those cases to return to the natural?
Yeah, but I think we would want, we'd want to do uh, stimulate regeneration with prescribed fires, for example, or other, planting techniques, and not just say, okay, we're gonna just let it rip and not do any firefighting or that type of thing.
Mhm.
And so yeah, for sure, if we're going to lose in, a terrestrial ecosystem uh, because of a lack of fire, then we need to find a solution to that. But the solution, again, is not just hands off whatever we think the most natural uh, regime is. And I think it is important also, like I mentioned in the article, that like we talk about this kind of 1800s and prior to that, these fire regimes as being natural when it's highly managed by people. It's indigenous cultural burning, or their controlled burning. And so really what we're saying when we say that the fire exclusion policy of the United States in the 20th century was an error, we're saying that this active management plan was worse than the previous active management plan. And we should try to go back to this previous type of active management plan of using prescribed fire uh, to reduce, the high severity fires and get other benefits from that. But it's not really like it's not a truly natural um, fire regime. And I think it's hard to know what it actually would, what the natural fire regime would be if you're defining natural as what the earth would look like without people at all. Because there's been people in North America, since the last glacial maximum. And so during the last glacial maximum, there was a lot less fire activity because of the climate being so different. But there's really no period of time that we can look at in Western North America where there's not people actively managing the landscape with fire. And so it's difficult to tease out what natural would even be in that case anyway.
Yeah, and kind of the contrast between those two different cultures, like Native Americans versus us today, we are managing the landscape, and they just happen to use fire as one of the crucial tools that they use to manage the landscape. But I mean, even with their managing of the landscape, they had certain priorities. Like I heard they would burn off a lot of the brush, so then there'd be more grass, so then they'd get more grazing animals. So it's like they were managing the landscape for their priorities. Then today, maybe we're not so much worried about having a lot of grazing animals walking around, but maybe we have a priority of like the timber industry being able to have wood come out of California. So then we could be altering our management strategies for that kind of priority as well. And it's actually not technically that much different than what the Native Americans were doing. We just have different priorities as times change.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. Yeah. In both cases, you have certain objectives and they overlap, I mean, significantly, I think. And that's what you're managing for is your goals. And I'm, yeah, in the piece arguing that a major goal should be the reduction of intense, catastrophic high severity wildfires.
And one and then a good way to do that is maybe we pick up on some of the tools that the Native Americans did seem to use better, which was using fire on the landscape, because it's just a pretty seems like efficient way to clear out the fuels and kind of mimic how things would have happened kind of historically.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what the frequency of burning would be, in areas in the lower elevation areas that aren't exposed to lightning very much. So I think it's hard to know that, and like and hard to reconstruct, what that would look like in the absence of humans. Um, so again, it's just this. But I don't think it matters. Like I don't think it matters what that is. It's just about it's about in this case mimicking what was done previously as I think we can objectively say was a better land management strategy for reducing the possibility of catastrophic wildfires. So it's basically like that previous strategy worked a lot better for obvious reasons, that like higher frequency is going to equal lower intensity and lower severity. wildfires or fires, and we should mimic that. And I think that is what the policy is, that the policies are very heavy on prescribed burning, or at least the plans from the California Wildfire Task Force and from the U.S. Forest Service have a huge emphasis on prescribed burning. So I think that is the direction that we're trying to go in.
Do you think there is some room for maybe shifting a little bit towards that one? I think you said like environmental group that says basically let fires do their thing. Where do you think there is some room within the next decade or two if we could maybe expose the public enough to this idea that some fires, if they start, maybe we put it into like Wharf S fire, which could model what it's going to do throughout the day today. And then we don't just put it out immediately. So then we end up getting more acreage burned under more normal conditions instead of just putting out as many fires as quickly as possible. And then having something like the park fire where you get 4 days in a row where the weather conditions are so extreme we can't possibly control it. And then you end up getting, it's almost like the curve of acreage burned just shifts all the way over to where the weather conditions are extreme. Then you get more high severity fire, more structures destroyed.
Yeah, it's a really tough question. I mean, they call it managed fire, right? That something starts naturally, or from a human, and we let it go kind of intentionally. I think you'd have to do that or make that judgment on a case by case basis. That if you think prevailing winds are such that you're not exposing large populations to smoke, if you think that it's not going to be super detrimental to economic activity in other sectors, and you think that there's not a lot of structures in people's way, then yeah, why not let that happen, I guess. But it is, you're kind of playing a dangerous game, that the longer you leave a fire out on the landscape, then the more likely it is that in 2 weeks you get some pickup of really bad fire weather conditions, which then is going to potentially make that thing spread, and risk other communities being engulfed by that fire. So it is this constant kind of risk calculation, probability, expected loss type of calculation that you're trying to do. So it's tough. But I'm sure there's plenty of circumstances where it seems like the risk is relatively small, where it makes sense to let it go.
Yeah, all would probably have to happen though is for it to go wrong once though, where they allow a fire to burn for 2 weeks and then all of a sudden the weather shifts around. And then if it takes out a community, then they would say, why didn't you put out that fire when it was small and we had the chance? And then
Yeah,
I'd
yeah,
imagine I personally wouldn't want to be one of the fire managers who had to make that call.
right.
It's a
Or
pretty
even,
hard sell on the
it's like
public.
how many structures is like too many structures, right? Like that I saw your video earlier today. You were looking at the Cal Fire structures lost and the ones with no damage and everything. And it's like, it's amazing for a fire this size how few structures have been affected. But let's say that we had a policy on the park fire to let it go because this is going to basically do a bunch of prescribed burning work for us. Um, even if it's 5 structures lost, like those people are not going to be very happy that you like literally did not try to save those that property, right? And so then where do you draw the line? Is it like 1? Is it 5? Is it 500? Is it 5,000?
Hmm.
It's very messy.
Yeah, very messy in that aspect. And then keep thinking back to like the vegetation as well. Is there also, this might be a bit of a tangent, but is there also something within this article about that even the environmentalists prioritize certain vegetation over other ones? Because like if I'm thinking about like the giant sequoias, for example, like everybody in California loves the giant sequoias. And it seems like in that aspect, what would be maybe match their more natural fire regime is frequent low severity fire. And that's where the interests are actually the exact same as humans, because more frequent low severity fire, that'd be less smoke produced, less risk of a fire going out of control. So it seems like things would match up right there. But even within that decision, we're saying, oh, it's good for the giant sequoias, but then it would also be bad for whatever like brush wants to grow in underneath them.
Yeah, I mean, I think any action or inaction is a choice, and they're all going to have you know, pluses and minuses for various species. So I mentioned before, you know, wood-boring beetles that take advantage of a bunch of dead trees after a high severity fire, and then the woodpeckers that eat the wood-boring beetles, and then, you know, there's the whole downstream consequences for ecosystems after that. And so a high severity fire is good for those initial, you know, for those beetles. That's part of, they did, you know, evolve to take advantage of that. Um, but it's not necessarily good for other species and, you know, habitat, and it's not necessarily good for people. So we have to take all of those things into consideration when we're doing these, you know, creating these management plans and thinking about how we're going to manage the landscape. And yeah, I don't think there's any way to do it where you don't basically have your thumb on the scale for some species or another, including human interests.
And then where the debate comes in is just where on that scale do you slide things? Like, obviously, you don't, as you said, just concrete over the entire forest. But then it's also saying, we'd actually prefer giant sequoias over beetles.
Yeah, yeah. And then unfortunately, people will just have to argue about that, and that's why we've kind of evolved, you know, democracies, right? That it's like, well, we're never going to have a consensus on everything, so we have a system where we kind of vote and, you know, indirectly vote through representatives, and the majority get most of what they want most of the time, and that's kind of the best we can do.
Gotcha. And then kind of trailing off of this, because I think this is where maybe my thought process going into reading your article has maybe shifted a little bit, is for whatever reason, my favorite ecosystem is the chaparral. Maybe it's because I've spent so much time hiking there, or just I think it's kind of cool how some of the plants, like chamise, for example, have basically adapted to wildfire, and not only adapted to it, but it almost seems like chamise encourages high severity fire and almost uses it to their advantage, which I just think is kind of a cool adaptation. But that's a case where in the chaparral, especially the central coast, where the central coast has the lowest amount of lightning in the lower 48, like lower in the United States, we would maybe get fire every 50 to 100 years. And then there'd be a huge fire that would just clear everything out. And then the chaparral would resprout because of its adaptations, like its burrows and its seeds that pop open when a fire comes through. So in the giant sequoias with humans, our interests align, low severity, frequent fire. But in chaparral, it would actually be in contrast, where it's we would want to just clear out a lot of the chaparral with fire. But if you do a prescribed fire every 5 years in the chaparral, it's not going to grow back. It's basically going to wipe it out. So then that's where the interests are contrasting. And then is that just where the debate comes in? It's how should people even be living there, or how much of the chaparral do we want to clear out in order to make it safe for people to live there?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think you kind of answered the question. That's where the debate comes in. I mean, I think hopefully we can use the way that tools have advanced, like you mentioned, WRF fire, to, you know, the more that we have confidence in something like that, then we can simulate thousands of different weather scenarios and weather conditions and ignition scenarios and fuel conditions, and say, like, how likely is it for a fire that occurs in the chaparral to spread into the wildland urban interface, and what's the risk that we're willing to tolerate of that, and is it worth it to say, well, you know, this ecosystem kind of evolved for high severity fire, but there's some chance that the higher the intensity of the fire, the more likely that it is that you know have a, you know, a non-forest fire go and decimate a town like what happened in Lahaina. Uh, and so that's again, it's like kind of a case by case, basis of where the community is and how likely the weather conditions are that would lead to that and all that. I don't think there's one clean answer on that.
Gotcha. So maybe where my thought process has to change a little bit is I think even a day ago, I was thinking you should try to do prescribed fire and thinning to match like what the vegetation in those different ecosystems is used to and has evolved to. Like we wouldn't do a ton of prescribed burning in the chaparral, but then we would up in the Sierra because that's how those different systems evolved. But maybe where the gap in my knowledge was is also being able to articulate that if we were to do that in the chaparral, that's going to put homes in the chaparral at much greater risk. And we also need to weigh that.
Yeah, I mean, or at least have large fuel breaks, adjacent to the communities, right?
Mhm.
I think it's debatable how much you'd need to do that at a distance, into the chaparral away from communities. But then again, it comes down to like a probability distribution of how far can an ember travel and under what circumstances and all that. So we're kind of just back to our risk tolerance again.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, maybe the point of the article is saying just because something is natural doesn't necessarily mean it's good. And there's a much more complex debate than just saying that.
Right. Yep.
Hmm. Nice. Well, I think yeah, I thought that article was super interesting. I'm glad you're able to kind of explain it to me and maybe fill in some of the gaps in my knowledge.
For sure. Yeah. Thanks for being interested in it, and happy to talk to you anytime.